going to present material from a book project which is almost done, and this book is co-authored by a German colleague of mine by the name of Jobst Landgräber. We've been collaborating together in a medical informatics context for many years, but more recently we've been working on what you might call the philosophy of AI. And one of the results of this work is a paper which you can find on Archiv. And this paper is a kind of draft of the main idea of the book, but as applied to language. Now, Jobst is even more interdisciplinary than I am. So he was born to a rather well-known German philosophical family. So his grandfather was Husserl's last assistant. He has degrees in mathematics, in medicine, so he was practiced as an MD for some time. Most importantly, a few years ago, he established a company called Cognotect, which is an AI company. So he knows how to make AI systems work. And we are both big believers in the value of AI systems. It's just that we think that the possibilities for AI systems are much weaker than the defenders of AI, visionaries of AI, like us to believe. So the book is very skeptical, apart from the final chapter where we express some optimism. And so these are the chapters. So we start with chapters on what intelligence is and how a machine might then recapitulate intelligence. Then we talk about language. Then we talk about what an AI system is in mathematical terms. And then we apply the results of this mathematical treatment of AI to determine the limits of AI systems, both in mastering language, in interacting with human beings. And then also we have a chapter devoted to various forms of science fiction. And so it's this science fiction chapter 12, which is going to form the center of what comes next. All right, so let's just recall how machine learning works. So when I say AI, I'm going to be focusing on the usual stochastic AI, whether it's called machine learning or deep learning or stochastic modeling. There are various terms for contemporary AI. What I say about contemporary AI will be applicable to all AI, because all AI works on a Turing machine. And there is no other way in which we can compute other than on a Turing machine. And since AI is meant to be computational intelligence, it follows that all AI is restricted by the limits of what a Turing machine will allow you to compute, the usual Turing computability limits. So how does machine learning work? We have a certain body of input data, for instance, a large collection of emails, and we watch as humans assign these emails to two different boxes, spam or not spam. So we then create a massive collection of input-output tuples, combining an email as input and a spam or not spam code as output. And then we use these tuples to train a neural net. And it's not very important what training means, but it's nothing like what training means when we're talking about human beings. And then once we train the machine, we can assign the neural net to new emails, which were not in the training set. And we can let the machine do the assignment automatically. Now, this works very well, but it only works if the new emails belong to a set which has the same variance as the set of emails used in training. Variance is a very important term. It's going to be occurring a lot during this talk. So roughly speaking, the new emails have to have the same patterns as the old emails. So if you get a new breed of email spam, then the neural net will no longer work. It won't capture the new kinds of spam. It will only capture those kinds of spam which were already present in the original training set. Now, clearly, new kinds of spam are being created all the time. And so any machine spam detector is going to suffer from a kind of drift away from the really important emails which are coming into the system. Now, this is how Google Translate works. Here, the input data are sentences in one language and then English translations of those sentences created by human beings. And then the neural network applies the model it has been building as a result of the process of training to new sentences and generates English translations. It's very, very impressive achievement. But again, it only works if the new German sentences have the same variance as the training sentences. And now German is changing all the time. New words are being added to the language, new fashions of expression, but most of all, new dialects. So each generation of children is creating new dialects, and then they get older and new generations of children come along. And these cause problems for variance of the translation mechanism, especially when we're dealing with spoken language. So while Google Translate is really good for written language, it becomes much less good as soon as we move into the realm of speech. And that's because of variance drift again. So what is an AI? It's a set of mathematical models which are implemented in a computer, which take input and compute output deterministically. Once the model has been trained, it's completely deterministic. Now we can think of the AI itself as a very long polynomial, something like this. We apply the very long polynomial, which we created by training the model. We apply it to an input value, x, and we get an output value, y. And x and y are numerical, they're complex vectors, typically. But of course, those numbers represent patterns which don't have to be numbers. They could be patterns of speech or patterns of text or patterns of images. The machine only works on numbers, but there are good ways of translating any kind of data into numbers, as I think everyone on this call knows. So text is relatively easy to translate, but Google fails completely in practical translation situations. So the idea here is that somebody who speaks Japanese has a traffic accident in the middle of Australia, and no one knows how to speak Japanese, but somebody is clever at sign language and manages to explain to the policeman who wants to address the problems caused by the accident what the Japanese lady is saying. And Google is hopeless. So if you take out your iPhone and use Google Translate in a context like that, it will fail completely. It can't replace human beings. Now, maybe it will get better, but still, this is not an easy problem for Google Translate as currently conceived. All right, now, similarly, the Turing test works really well, or anyway, somewhat well, when it comes to written language, but spoken language causes problems. So I think we all know what the Turing test is. The interrogator, and that's what Turing calls the person, it's an interrogator, has to determine which of two input-output mechanisms is a machine and which is a human, and the machine passes the test if it can convince 30% of interrogators after 5 minutes that it is questioning a human being. And someone claimed in 2014 that they had built a machine which was modeling I think an 8-year-old Ukrainian boy called Eugene to pass the test. And I don't believe it. I think that this is an example. So there's something wrong there are more examples. So this is a longer a piece of the conversation. I'll leave it to you to read through it quickly. There's something wrong with Scott, not with Eugene. Scott is asking really weird questions, and Eugene is giving really weird answers. Now, they are sort of convincing answers if you think yourself into a position of a young boy who likes trick questions and trick conversations, but it doesn't convince me that this is a human being. It doesn't convince me of anything except that I'm confused. But there's clearly something missing from the test. And so Jobst and I invented a new test, which we call the Stasi test. And here we insist that the subject has to be an adult. So I don't believe that the Stasi would interrogate children, although who knows. And the interrogations should be of arbitrary length, not 5 minutes, but roughly this length of time that a typical interrogation segment would be in a Stasi Hauptquartier. And then we're not restricted to questions and answers. We can form the conversation in any way, including by shouting at the machine, as it were. And then we insist that the dialogue is in spoken form, because it's in spoken form that most of the interesting human relevant information comes through. And now we claim that there's no way that any machine will ever pass the Stasi test. So let's just think a little bit about how humans pass the Turing test. Eugene, how do, not Eugene, me or Catherine, how do we pass the Turing test? We seem to be cleverer than Eugene. Well, we have capabilities to speak a language, which are capabilities that we have because of very, very complicated neurophysiological structures in our brains. In fact, in our bodies, because speech involves more than just the brain. So we have these neurophysiological structures, first of all, because of our genetics, but we are not genetically programmed to speak English or German. In order to speak English, we have to learn English, and this we get from our parents or from our peers and so forth. Those two combined create, in the course of our childhood, the ability to speak a specific language. And not just the brain is involved, but the whole body, really, because we need to have air pumping through our mouth and being shaped by our teeth in order to be speaking. This is a whole body phenomenon. The hands are involved because we make gestures with our hands as we speak and so forth. And now the next feature to note is that language makes lying easy. So it's very hard to lie if you don't have language. And as soon as language becomes easy, that means that language easy to lie with, that means that language becomes dangerous. Because if you meet someone that you've never known and they start speaking to you, it could be that that someone has not friendly goals with regard to you. And this is particularly difficult in our early ancestral environment, when everyone could be a stranger unless they came from your own immediate family. And so over some 150,000 years, human beings have developed neurophysiologically grounded mechanisms for coping with this situation, that language is a very easy mechanism to lie with. And that's why when you meet another human being, you immediately start asking questions about their biography. You want to know where they come from. You want to know what views they hold, what their habits are. And all of that is to determine whether they are trustworthy. And this means that to pass the Stasi test, the machine will need a cover story. It will need to have a biography. It will need to be born somewhere. And this cover story is just information. It's full of gaps. So Ingarden, who was a philosopher, one of the great ontologists of the 20th century, wrote a book on the literary work of art, and he pointed out that there are always what he called Unbestimmtheitsstellen, which means spots of indeterminacy in the structure of the literary work, because the literary work can't specify everything about any of its characters. Now, a human life has no spots of indeterminacy. It's part of reality. Of course, we might forget features of our life, but it's our life, and so we remember many features of our life, and we remember them often in ways which are tinged with emotions. So when we talk about what we did, then we will be expressing ourselves using emotional tone, and a good interrogator will sense this emotional tone, and it will notice the absence of the emotional tone. Now, a computer is going to have to imitate all of that if it's going to pass the Stasi test. And the reason is, of course, that if we did not have these extremely complicated emotional and linguistic capabilities, we would never have survived to have ancestors. So we are incredibly effective cheater detector mechanisms. That's what keeps us alive. That's what enables us to form societies. And to create those cheater detector mechanisms, it took, I don't know, of the order of 3 million years. All right, now, Google Translate is an incredibly complicated polynomial. It has 213 million parameters. But there are so many different kinds of variants involved in human language, especially spoken language. Variants having to do with context, having to do with tone, having to do with setting, having to do with things like accents and dialects, and contextually determined ways of using language in a church or in a court or in an aeroplane. All of these different kinds of variants mean that Google Translate has to have many more parameters if it's going to deal with the variance in question. And this number 213 to the 30th, you shouldn't take it too seriously, but it's telling us that it's going to be really difficult to collect enough data to capture all the variants that would be necessary to build a machine that would pass the Stasi test. I put in here the slightly more realistic number 24.3. I will explain that number later. Now, to give you some examples, the Turing test originally is set up in such a way that it's just an question answer series. It's like a very, very well edited interview. But of course, speech isn't like that. Speech is full of interruptions. There's typically no real turn taking. And an example, this is an example from a linguistics text, an example of a real conversation and about centipedes and shoes. And these are all places where more than one person is speaking. There are 5 people speaking simultaneously in the middle of the bottom chunk of text here. Now, that the 5 people speaking simultaneously may not be entirely typical, but that people interrupt each other is very common. It's a characteristic of ordinary conversation. And again, that means extremely complicated problems for the machine already from the point of view of hearing. And machines don't really hear, nor do they see in the way that we do. They have to translate pixels or sensory data coming from sensors into numerical vectors. And it's going to be very difficult to do that where conversations are of this form. But these are just practical problems. I'm not here putting forward a practical thesis to the effect that machines at the moment, given the current hardware and given the current software, can't pass the Stasi Turing test. The thesis I want to put forward is a thesis of impossibility, however the hardware or the software may develop. All right, so the first reason why machines can't pass the Stasi test is because we can never collect enough data to capture the dimensions of variance. And I could talk for hours on that problem alone. But the real problem is that even if we had all the data we needed, we still could not program the machine without variance drift. And we talked a little bit about that earlier. We'll talk more about it as we go along. All right, so the chapter 9 of the book is called There Will Be No Machine Intelligence. Now, in order to build a machine which can work reliably, and work reliably means give, in the case of Google Translate, or in the case of a spam detector mechanism, it means provide useful information to the user. And so that it's important that Google Translate doesn't send you off in the wrong track, and it will become ever more important as people rely on it more and more. But it's even more important if your AI system is working in a nuclear power station or in a medical hospital where you're dealing with remote surgery or with computerized surgery. We want our AI to be able to predict with very high accuracy. Now, stochastic AI is based on statistics. It's based on the fact that where we're dealing with statistical phenomena, it's very often the case that the patterns of variance in one collection of data are mimicked quite very well in the patterns of variance in related collections of data. And that's what we rely upon when we train a system in order to perform a certain function against new data. And the thesis is that as soon as we start dealing with complex systems, like human language or human behavior in general, then our model will very quickly become out of date because of variance drift. And that's because of the nature of complex systems. Complex systems are constantly evolving at many different levels and at many different speeds. And I will give you some examples as we go along. All right, so I said already that there's no room here for anything like consciousness. There's no room here for anything like perception. There's no room here for anything like the will, because this is deterministic. And this is just the application of a function to a certain body of data. It's inside a machine. There's no way in which you can have consciousness or perception or will. You can mimic it, you can emulate it, perhaps very well, but you can't have actual consciousness, perception, or will. I could stop here. I could say, who would want digital immortality if the immortality did not involve consciousness, did not involve perception, and did not involve having a will? I would not want it. I don't think anyone would want it. And there is no room for it, so it's impossible. But I have more to say. So this is already enough in a way, but I have more to say. So the machine doesn't perceive, it transforms data into more data. That's not perceiving. All right, this is the hero of the day, heroine. So this is Martine Rothblatt. She is a very successful business lady with some radical ideas. And so she has an interesting metaphysical view of transgenderism. So to be transgender is to have the feeling that you're trapped in the wrong body. And she believes in freedom of gender as the gateway to a freedom of form, as she says. And now, if you ask anyone who's transgender, they'll tell you they're trapped in the wrong body. But me, I'm trapped in the wrong body because I'm trapped in a body. All bodies, she says, are the wrong body. She wants to be free of body. Now, in order to understand what that would mean, we need to understand identity. We wouldn't need to understand what it means by she, when she is going to be freed from her body. So what is going to be, what has to survive in order to make a transplant, for instance, where your brain is moved to a different flesh body? What has to survive to make the transplant worthwhile? Well, consciousness, perception, feeling, and so forth. You want just those things to be the same. Otherwise, it's not you who's surviving. So your identity, what is that? It's something like a complex pattern of dispositions to feel and think perhaps act in certain ways. And again, it results from genotypic and environmental influences. It's your neural substrate. And this is developing through time. Because it's developing through time, particularly when you're growing up, but also when you're experiencing things in the world, it's subject to variance drift, just to remind you. All right, so what would have to survive in order that you would want to survive? Well, you want to have the capability to have conscious experiences, but you also want to have conscious experiences in other words, you want to realize that capability. Moreover, you want those new conscious experiences to be in the same chain of conscious experiences as the ones you had on Earth, as it were. And you could never know that that will be so, of course. So if you're going to pay the price, and there is a company in California that will take your money already, to become digitally immortal, then you have to have a great faith that your consciousness will still be there, consciously being conscious, once you have been uploaded into the cloud, or however this digital immortality is going to be arranged. And you have absolutely no grounds for confidence. In fact, you have every possible ground for running as far as possible away from anyone who claims to be able to give you digital immortality, because it's impossible. All right, so your identity, John's identity, is a complex of dispositions that determine your reactions to stimuli. And when John is alive, the material basis of these dispositions is John's neural substrate. So it looks like this. And then it looks like this. So John's brain, or the contents of John's brain, is uploaded to a computer. And then John's identity, the very same thing, has its material, which is a collection of dispositions, has its material basis in a digital substrate, which is some pattern of bits on a hard drive somewhere. Now, the same thing, John's identity is a capability to be conscious, remember. And what that means is that the inputs, when similar inputs are presented to John at time t1, they will yield similar outputs to those inputs which are projected to John at t2, outputs in the form of John's conscious reactions. But there can't be any conscious reactions because it's a machine, but we'll leave that aside for the moment. We'll just assume that this scenario is possible. All right. So one big problem, first of all, is the variance drift. But here we don't just have variance drift. We have variance falling off a cliff, because the stochastic model, which is going to capture John's identity, is created when John is alive. It's created on Earth. And it's going to be, that's the training time. That's when we create the stochastic model. It's at runtime. John is no longer on Earth. John is just a pattern of bytes on a hard drive somewhere. There is no Earth around him. The contexts are completely and utterly different. And that means that the variance is really 100%. There is no similarity in context, because there are no contexts in the uploaded form. The capabilities are completely different. The expressions are completely different. So the variance is total, I would say. But this is just one feature. Let's assume that we've solved this variance problem. Now let's go back to transgenderism for a minute. So the goal of both the transgenderist and the transhumanist is that your identity should survive a transformation of your body. So in the transgender case, it's actually quite easy. So your body, after you undergo transgender surgery, is still the same body. It's just been changed. Now you think of it as being such that you earlier had the wrong body, now you have the right body, but in fact, it's still the same body. It's just been changed in order to be the right body. So there's no metaphysical problem here. The metaphysical problem arises when you think about what the bearer, what the material substrate of your identity is going to be once the transition has taken place. And now this is Martine Rothblatt's account of this. This is an early account which has a most wonderful terminology that I can't resist using this earlier account. So some people talk about genes. Richard Dawkins started talking about memes, which are cultural genes somehow, genes of cultural transition or inheritance. Martine talked in 2006 about bemes, which are fundamental units of beingness. And what that means is that they are units of things like mannerism and personality, feelings, and so forth. And each beam is comprised, and this, I'm not making this up, of large number of bemeotides, which are much like gene base pairs, she says. And the beam is mightier than the gene. So if we can describe all the beams in a human being, then we've described all we need to know in order to replicate that human being, for instance, through cryonics, where we freeze a human being and then reawaken it when we know how to do that. We can have beam revival. And so how do we capture beams? Well, everybody would have a bouquet of nanowires threaded through the capillaries of their brain to monitor and record the activities of individual brain cells. Now, this is, medically speaking, of course, nonsense. But still, let's play along with it for the moment. So beams would need to be uploaded into what she calls mindware to become conscious. So we have mindware in our brains, so the beams become conscious in our brains already, but we need mindware in the cloud so that the beams from our minds can be uploaded into the cloud, and using the mindware in the cloud, they would become conscious. This is the idea. So we're going to beam ourselves into cyberspace. And actually, how will we know that the uploaded beamans, she says, are conscious? And her answer is, consciousness is like pornography. We know it when we see it. And my answer to that is, well, good luck, and you go first. This leads to a new understanding of what a person is. So there are biological persons and there are persons inside computers. And the reason is that persons are really just patterns. And the same patterns can be present in a flesh person and in a digital person. And then reproduction will be occurring by mixing the beams. And this is how she conceives of having beam babies, beeman babies. So we are fertile offspring, and we can bring into being a new species, which she called persona creatus. She really meant persona creata, and the persona creata are alive. You can have sex and so on, and citizenship, and there's a question of euthanasia if they go senile and so on. So this is the beam pattern. The same beam pattern is your identity, and you live on because in the cloud there is some computer which has your beam pattern. There are many, many obvious problems with this. You could have billions of beamans, all of which are you, and that causes. I'm not interested in those kinds of problems. I'm interested in the very possibility of this nonsense. All right, so the beam pattern, your identity, has to be able to act, think, feel, and remember. It could play chess, blind chess. It couldn't play tennis. It could think it plays tennis, but it couldn't play tennis. All right. So this is the idea is that there will be a seamless transition here. So is it all possible? Now, Faraday had this maxim: anything which is consistent with the laws of nature is possible. But so it's consistent with the laws of nature that something like this might happen, I guess, depending on your definition of a beam pattern. But Faraday's maxim has to be modified. it's not good enough just to be consistent with the laws of physics. You also have to be able to build it in a process that is consistent with the laws of physics, which include the laws of neurobiology and so on. And so how do we do that? Well, there is this amazing book by Nick Bostrom. I think it's a work of science fiction, but it's amazing in many, many dimensions. So Bostrom thinks that the way to achieve B-man identity, in other words, the way to achieve a sufficiently intelligent computer that it can be sufficiently intelligent to be you, or to contain you within its memory, is by what he calls whole brain emulation. And he really thinks that whole brain emulation is possible. And there are 3 steps: scan the brain, translate the scans to get an interpretation, and thereby a software model of your neural system, and then create a simulation in a machine. So let's go through the steps. The first step is to chemically fixate your brain material for microscopic imaging. The problem with that is it will kill you. Indeed, it will kill you. So that's a small problem. It will kill the cells, which means that you can't image the dynamics of the cells. But dead cells are useless if you want to have a whole brain emulation. You don't want to emulate the whole brain as a dead, static lump of dead cells. You want to emulate the living brain, which means you want to image the dynamics of the molecular interactions of all the cells before death, and that you can't do with classical imaging techniques. You killed all the signaling, which is what creates the dynamics of a brain. So Bostrom says, well, Moore's law, computers are getting faster. So soon, or at some stage, we will have really good MRI techniques which can somehow magically capture the dynamics of the brain without fixation. Now, there's a resolution problem here. So we would need to have resolution 3 orders of magnitude smaller and faster than is available on any currently conceivable imaging platform, because the events we want to capture are on the level of a few atoms. So let's assume we have magic MRI. Step 2 is translation. So we have magic MRI. We can simultaneously measure the amount of all transmitters in all synaptic clefts and track and measure all the ion flux and chemical and other signaling events in billions and billions of molecules, constantly changing. And remember, we capture this in a single brain at a certain age. So in 5 minutes, what we would need to capture would be quite different, which is an opening here for variance drift. And then, because our mental experiences are the results of the collaboration of all of those many neuronal and peripheral events at very fine granularities, and because each cell contributes to the experience by exhibiting a relevant behavior, we're going to have to model in our software a gigantically complex system made of gigantically large numbers of elements. And I don't think I need to go. This is just saying what I just said, but now with a numbered list. Now, there are still physical hardware problems which are probably unsolvable. So imaging can't get inside the cell, and nearly all of the activities which I just described go on inside the cell. Imaging techniques don't have sufficient resolution, that I've already said. But even if we supposed that those 2 problems would be solved, we still have the problem that we have no way of creating a mathematical model to interpret those data because of variance drift. Now, what does that mean? Well, remember, we can have 2 kinds of mathematical model. We can either create a model deliberately ourselves, or we can have the machine create a model by training a neural net. Training a neural net is creating a long polynomial. Now we create that long polynomial in terms of the data that we've just collected from the brain of John. An extremely large amount of data, but that's going to give us the possibility to train a neural net, we think, which we can apply to all of the data, which is similar to the data from which we just attained a dynamic map of John's brain. But we achieved that dynamic map only from John at a certain time, in a certain context, with a certain degree of hunger and a certain, he's just fallen in love or he's just fallen out of love. So we capture John at a certain point in time, let's say 5-second interval to be optimistic, although every second is going to add petabytes cubed of data. But it doesn't help, because in a few days or in a few minutes, John is going to have a different set of appetites and desires and knowledge and different contexts. Above all, he's no longer going to be in an MRI machine. He's going to be outdoors swimming or something. So this variance drift goes off in every direction. The model that we create, however much data we feed into the neural net for training purposes, is still going to suffer immediately from variance drift, and it will get worse and worse as time goes by. And that's true not just for this complex system, it's true for every complex system, because for complex systems, we can only ever build an approximative model, and approximative models are always subject to variance drift. That's a mathematical fact, although I'm expressing it since I'm not a mathematician. Jobst is a mathematician, and if he were here, he would express it in the appropriate way. So step 3 is simulation. We're supposed to be able, on the basis of the model created in steps 1 and 2, we're supposed to be able to create a simulation of John's mind, John's identity in the computer. And since step 1 is impossible and step 2 is 23.4 orders of magnitude more impossible, then this is all impossibility on stilts. So we can't do the whole brain emulation. Now, there are other strategies, and I just want to give one more slide. It may take me a minute to find it. So quantum computing won't work. It's just faster. It's still a Turing machine. It still has exactly the same problems. So Bostrom, this is my final slide. Bostrom thinks that there are other strategies which might work also. And he wants to try all the strategies for complicated reasons having to do with his desire to avoid the world being taken over by an evil superintelligence. So he thinks that we can get superintelligence also by biologically enhancing existing brains. And the idea of doing this is that we select at the pre-implantation stage embryos which we diagnose as having high intelligence, or as being embryos which will lead to high intelligence individuals. And he thinks that if we select 999 out of every 1,000 embryos for discarding, so we have 1 out of 1,000 embryos left, then this is a quote now, can yield an increase of up to 24.3 IQ points. And so if we do this for 10 years or so, we will create a superintelligence. Now, there are 24.3 problems with this nonsense. So I really am speechless when I try to read it out. So I can't say that I recommend Nick Bostrom's work because of its philosophical value or its scientific value. It's just very, very strange. So I recommend it for those people who like to read very strange things. And I don't have anything more to say, I'm afraid. So that's the end. I hope you're all still there.
Great.